Hey everyone, hope you're having a great day so far and a great conference. First time here in Toronto, I believe, for NDC. I was actually working in Toronto a few years ago for a client, and in one of the evenings I went out for dinner with my wife and my colleague who I was working with, and we were walking through one of the small park areas, and as we were turning around the corner, some guy was coming the other way with his dog, and he like jumped out of the way and he started apologizing like, I'm so sorry. Like all those stereotypes about Canadian people being friendly, it's actually true. I was pretty excited when the conference was here. I was like, yeah, I would love to go there. I think something weird happens with the border, right? Like you go north of that border and people turn friendly. So yeah, very happy to come here. But I like the other locations as well. NDC picked some great locations. Porto's another great one. Anyways, I changed the title of my talk. Can you guess what the title of this talk was before? Exactly. Like, if I don't have that, my career's over. Like, if you don't add that into your talk somewhere, your career's over. But actually, I started doing this talk 1 year ago without the AI bit, and I worked on some projects in the last 6 months. So I thought, yeah, actually, I'll include some new stuff, and that new stuff just happens to be AI. So I'll tell you at the start exactly what I'm going to cover, and then you can decide if it's any good or not. So the idea of the talk is around the patterns. Everyone's working with legacy systems, and everyone typically at some point in their career is trying to get from some old system to some new system, and patterns can help us get there. But actually, what I've learned since doing this talk and really thinking about the topic as much as possible and how to explain it, what I realized is, yeah, you get people like Martin Fowler and Sam Newman, they talk about microservices to monolith, and they have the books with all these patterns in. But actually what I realized is when you're doing these legacy migrations, you're modernizing legacy systems, you're making a lot of decisions on a daily and a weekly basis, a lot of micro decisions. And actually the patterns don't really cover everything. So I think there are some building blocks, some of the key building blocks, which I'm always thinking about. Even when I'm not using patterns, these are the kind of building blocks I'm thinking about. They're probably not the only ones. I think these are the ones that come up on a daily basis. You hit a problem, you've got some legacy, you're trying to get to something new on a particular feature, you hit a particular problem. Let me try and get rid of that. No, that didn't get rid of it. Yeah, I don't know how to get rid of that at the bottom, so we'll just have to keep it. It'll disappear now. So basically, you're modernizing some legacy systems. You've got like a new architecture you're trying to get to. You've got the current legacy one. You've probably got weeks or months, maybe even years of migration work. And here are the things that I'm thinking about on a daily basis. So migrating a write operation. If you've got a legacy and you've got a new system, at some point, every modification has to go into the new system and not the old one. So when you're faced with a problem, one of the choices, one of these building blocks or basic options is the next step I can take, these are kind of like the next steps you can take, is I can take a consumer who's writing to this old legacy system, I can move them to a new legacy system, like a micro decision. Equally, you can decide for the next step, I'll take a read operation. This consumer, this website, this partner API, they're currently querying this old legacy API. I can build a new one and migrate them to this new read operation. Then data, sometimes that's the next step. What's the next step we need to take on our migration journey? We have the big vision and the plan, but what's the next small step we take? Maybe the next step is you've migrated some write operations. Now you need to migrate the data so that the new system has the data so the write operation can actually fully validate the write operation, for example. This one down here, probably the most interesting, I would say, mapping between models. A lot of times people think about the legacy system and the new system. You just migrate functionality, sometimes add some new functionality, but actually a lot of the challenges I see, especially my current job at Payfit, we have very different models. The legacy system, the words, the phrases, the whole domain concepts, they represent how the business was 10 years ago. And the new system is like taking a blank canvas, redesign the system. So a lot of these challenges are, how do we translate how the current system works onto the new system? And then as part of this, there's also running the new and the old in parallel, deciding which things do we run in parallel, which size of scope, what's the granularity that we migrate a functionality. And then routing. Routing's obviously an important piece, always thinking about that. Where does the request enter the system? How do we make sure that the flow goes to the new or the old, depending on how far we are in the migration journey? And then the next one is kind of related to the mapping between models. A lot of time we have to think about what functionality are we keeping, are we getting rid of, is going to evolve a bit. Maybe the old system doesn't do it in a very elegant way or an inefficient way. So that's always a thing that we're always thinking about, always challenging it. You know, we might have a plan, and as we get into the details, we're like, hang on a sec, we agreed to migrate this, but do we actually need to? Let's go back to the business and really challenge this one. So that's always something I'm thinking about, how to avoid doing work, you could say. And then the last one is getting into the current system. Even when I've been like 1 year, 2 years into a modernization project, we're still going back and learning things about the legacy system and realizing, does it actually work that way? There's some really core functionality that hasn't been touched for like a number of years, and you're like, actually, maybe we need to step back and dig back into that thing in more detail. So these are kind of like building blocks and like granular pieces, which I think are crucial. The patterns are very useful as well. I'll get to those shortly. Something else that I find really important is at what depth are you modernizing something when you're fixing some old system? There's some very different approaches out there. For example, these days, what I'm seeing a bit more of is, let's take the old legacy system as it is, let's rewrite it in a new language, and then let's modernize it. You can also take the other approach, which is, let's migrate the legacy system piece by piece, and let's fix and improve things at the same time. There's like two different kind of approaches there. So I'm always thinking about this. Whenever we want to migrate some piece of the legacy, always asking, at what level do we go here? Do we start trying to challenge the whole business process? Do we fix the UX? Or do we just try and get this bit of code from legacy system to new system and leave everything else around it as it is? And then we have the whole modularity topic. Very often when you're taking stuff from a legacy, you're not just taking something there and moving it over here. Like the shapes don't fit. It's like different shaped pieces. Like in your new world, you have this nice new architecture with these separate pieces. But in the legacy, you've got bits of things that are related, scattered everywhere. You've got dependencies between things that shouldn't have dependencies. And so you've got to try and get from that to this at the same time as replacing it and the other options we talked about. So there's a lot of stuff going on at the same time. And that's why the patterns can be helpful, but always thinking about those building blocks. Like you might say, oh, let's move that line to here and that line to here. Let's put those things together and then move it across. The patterns don't really cover everything, so it's always important to be thinking a bit more step by step. So that's the migration bit. And then the second bit is, can AI help with any of this? How much? I don't have all the answers, but I have some recent experiences to share. I wouldn't call them answers. I wouldn't say anything I can give you today around AI topic is an answer, but it's something I did, and here's what happened, and maybe that might be useful in some way to you. So I'll give you the answers up front. One of the most interesting things I found about using AI on one of these migration projects, I'll go into the details later. One of the most interesting things was using AI for project management, building some custom tooling to help us with modernization. I would say that was probably more interesting and more beneficial than actually writing the code. We had this AI who was fully plugged into our modernization project. It knew about everything we were trying to achieve, and it became like a team assistant. I think mapping out the current states was something where AI helped us to go. I reckon it would have taken me and my colleague 2 or 3 weeks to map out the current system. With AI, it does that in like 30 minutes. So if you trust the results, if you can make the results trustworthy. So that's the whole challenge around that. I think once we built our plan, it did help us to execute that plan faster, obviously with some challenges. And one of the other interesting things I found with AI was, so we have this plan, we have the project management setup of all these things we need to migrate. We have to work in probably 20 to 30 different code bases in the company for this one project to migrate things. And what I found was, as I moved into this kind of manager role, where I'm managing, me and my colleague were kind of managing these agents or managing these streams of work, I found it was actually easier to do multiple things in parallel. And so sometimes you might get to like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and normally you would say, oh, I don't have the energy to go from this code base and get my head into this code base and start working on this. But with AI, I found like, yeah, let's just start that. Tell this agent to go work on that next task. I'll have a look at the pull request. If I'm too tired, I'll leave it till tomorrow. If it's not as difficult as I thought, I'll just spend some time on that now. So those are the takeaways. I'll talk you through the project and everything, how I got to these answers. And probably one of the key things that I learned from this is that there's a very big discrepancy between what I think AI is useful for and I think what Anthropic wants you to think it's useful for. If you look at all the marketing coming out of Anthropic, and as Scott Hanselman said yesterday, Git commit co-authored with Claude. Claude's this person, this AI person who does work and is a member of your team. No, it's not. I think it's more of a tool, definitely. And I found out the best results we got when we started building all the harnesses around it. In fact, using AI for as little as possible, for the bits that you can't use deterministic tools and some of your own insights and knowledge. I'll share some examples of that too. So yeah, that's how the talk is structured. I broke it down into like 3 different sections. First one is around the common patterns, not related to AI. The second part of the talk, I'll share some of the things we're modernizing at Payfit, the company I'm currently working for, and I'll talk a bit about the bits I worked in. And then part 3, I'll share what I worked on since the start of like end of last year, start of this year, one of the particular projects that's inside this big modernization program, and how we used AI for that and how I came to all those bullet points on the previous slide. So let's talk about the patterns. Like I said, the building blocks are probably the most important thing, but the patterns are very useful. It's good to think about which pattern am I using and which of these building blocks does the pattern use. So the first pattern everyone talks about is the strangler fig. Martin Fowler wrote a blog post about this. Sam Newman put it in his book, and everyone thinks the strangler fig is the most useful pattern and the most important pattern. I did a workshop sometime and I asked people like, list some patterns. I think there were like 5 or 6 groups and every single group put strangler fig first. So if you're one of those people who thinks the strangler fig is a legacy migration pattern, it's not. Because all it is, right? I don't mean to be pedantic here, but I do get pedantic about some of these things. All the strangler fig is Martin Fowler's pet name for an incremental migration. If you're not doing a big bang rewrite, you're doing strangler fig. So it's not really a pattern, I would say. People hear about this and they think it's something, and very often that something looks a bit like this because he had a diagram like that in his blog post where the request comes in and you decide new or old. That's not the only way to do strangler fig. In fact, you can do strangler fig in various ways. You can have a request coming into the new system, and the new system decides, do I handle it myself, or do I go legacy? You can have requests coming into your legacy, and the legacy decides, do I handle it myself, or do I send it to the new code? That's the routing I was talking about, like routing, one of the key building blocks. One of the things the strangler fig doesn't really touch on that much is the data. Like you can have all this fancy routing in your code, but I would say that the data part of migration is the hardest when you're running things in parallel. You build some new piece of code It might have its own database, because that was kind of a big topic in the last decade, having these separate systems with their own databases. So you can have this separate thing, but if a customer creates a record in your new system and you still have customers using your old system, they're probably going to expect that UI to display it there as well. So whether you create or modify some record in your new or legacy, you're probably going to have to keep those things synchronized so that the user experience is consistent. I don't want to see on my phone, I place an order on the website, but it's not on my phone, for example. Like, you have to keep things synchronized. So various ways of keeping things synchronized. I will say the main kind of approaches, not really patterns, is the domain events, change data capture. Some people confuse those two things. I'll share some examples of that. Batch import jobs can still be used, and even a shared database can be used. So again, these are kind of like the fundamental directions you can take. And on any one project, you might use some or all of these in various different places. I think that's the reality between the books and the reality. The books are like, you choose this pattern, you choose this data integration approach. But the projects I've worked on, you've got like all these patterns happening all at once in different parts of the system. And it's, like I said, it's a lot of micro decisions. So you're doing the strangler fig. You've got some new code and some old code. They both have their own databases. They need to stay in sync. One of the key choices that we've been thinking a lot about at Payfit, and we use both of these in different places, is CDC versus events. So at Payfit, we're moving towards an event-driven architecture. And so what we like to have is events going between systems. And one of the ideas that people have is we can publish some events from a legacy system. So if you register an employee in the legacy system, you can publish an event and it can be sent across to the new system. That looks great on paper, but then you realize there are 20 different ways of creating employees for different countries, different workflows. And if you forget to publish an event for one of those scenarios, you've got data inconsistencies, and it can be very subtle. You can have these use cases that don't get used very often, like some kind of batch imports, like a customer does that once a month, and suddenly everything's going well for like 3 weeks, and then at the end of the month. In fact, at the end of the month is kind of like the peak season at Payfit. Payfit's like a payroll company. At the end of the month, people want to get paid, so everything just breaks then. So the event approach is valid. We do use that a lot at Payfit, but if you're worried that you might miss a place and you might forget to publish an event somewhere, then you can use CDC. CDC is where you set up triggers in your database. So whenever some piece of data is modified, it will publish an event. So you don't have to figure out all the places in your code. You can just have database triggers. But with the database triggers, you can lose context if you've got bits of data across different tables. And you might not realize when someone's changing an employee's name, for example, like, why are they changing the name? Was it a mistake? Have they got married? If you're only capturing the low-level data changes, you can lose that context. So that can be quite challenging. So both of these approaches are useful, and they're both really annoying. So when we get to the application level, there's some patterns from domain-driven design that are very interesting in this area. And like I was saying before, you can do this in different ways. And this is also where we touch on the domain modeling aspect. So the simplest pattern is the bubble. And the idea with the bubble is you start building your new system as its own separate system. And then whenever your system needs to interact with the legacy, or it needs to save data or load data, you'll have a translation layer called an anti-corruption layer that can map that onto one or multiple systems. So the benefits of this approach are you can start with a new code base. You don't have to go into legacy. It's also an anti-pattern to do that. It's like, we don't want to touch the legacy. It's always easy to just start with a new code base and ignore the legacy. But it can be valid in a lot of cases. We do this at Payfit. The risk with this pattern is that the cost of your translation become very high and very complex. And sometimes this translation can be more complex in your new code. and you can run into problems that way. And like we were talking about with Martin Fowler's strangler fig example, this pattern doesn't actually dictate too many constraints. It's like a general idea. And then there's a kind of a second variation of it where you introduce a database. So now you say the new bubble will have its own data store. So brand new code, brand new database, even more new stuff. So you avoid touching the old stuff. And now you decide to keep things synchronized. We synchronize at the data level. So you might use CDC here. So the translation here, in this version, all this translation is code. In this version, the translation is some kind of data synchronization script. Could be something that runs every night, could be CDC. It could be some kind of outbox style pattern where you poll the table and you update the other systems. It could be events or APIs. The pattern doesn't overprescribe any particular implementation. But when you look at these two patterns, I think the key lessons here are how much do you want to touch your legacy versus how much do you want to start by creating something new and fresh? In domain-driven design, it's all about the domain model, right? And so this pattern is really, you want to be able to start with a brand new domain model. And with this one, it's just giving even more autonomy, because here you can start with a new domain model, but you have to map it onto the old data model. Here, you can have your new domain model, you can have your new data model, and then you do the mapping at the data level. So again, it's like, where do you want that mapping to happen? This is kind of what this pattern's offering you. And then sometimes you might not want to migrate your legacy. You might decide for some pieces we'll keep them. That's kind of this point again about what do we keep and what do we replace. So you can put an API on your old system, or you can put an event on your old system. I don't recommend this pattern, and I'll tell you why later. I do recommend events, but not in this way. And then like we talked about before, migrating the rights first is a valid option in terms of not just one step, but in terms of how do we map out this piece of work. We could do all the right operations first. So you build your new system. This could be your bubble here, your autonomous bubble, and you decide the autonomous bubble will be used to handle all write operations or some write operations, and then we'll choose one of those synchronization strategies. The kind of benefits of doing this approach are, by taking ownership of the write model, you can actually add new functionality. You can add new ways to create employees and things like that, or whatever the concepts are in your domain. Again, the challenge is the consistency. If all your customers are still reading from here, and you've got your website that still uses a legacy database as the source of truth, you have to make sure the legacy system is kept in sync. And you also have some kind of mapping challenge here, because you have your new model and your new data model. What if you add new fields over here that don't exist in your legacy model? Have some very interesting challenges with this at Payfit. And I've worked on some government projects where we had to be very inventive in solving this problem. So again, looks easy on paper. In reality, it's actually not easy. And you can do it the other way as well. This is actually a very common approach too. So you can say, we're going to build a new system first. And to begin with, it will only handle read operations. So new database, new code, some synchronization mechanism that takes all your legacy data and puts it in a new database. Benefits of this approach. If your legacy database is not performing well on the read side, if someone comes to your website and it takes 10 seconds to load because your legacy database is being overwhelmed, this can give you instant performance benefit. You can go from 10 seconds to like 0.2 seconds. Equally, your legacy system APIs might not be as flexible as you need. It might be difficult to add a new parameter or a new search query, for example. Here, you have all the data. You can build new APIs for querying that however you want to. But again, if you take this approach, you're somewhat limited by your legacy. And this new model you build here might be influenced too much by your legacy. So that's, again, that mapping challenge. When do you do the mapping, and how do you manage that? You might put some kind of anti-corruption layer here to handle that as a short-term step. And then again, you're kind of back in the bubble. So this is kind of also can be the bubble context in a way. And we use this one at Payfit as well. I've got an example of that. And so here's the thing. When you're running things in parallel, I would say this is probably one of the most challenging things for sure. Over the last year or so, I've been working on a particular project. When Martin Fowler talks about this strangler fig, about doing things incrementally, it sounds cool, right? Don't do the big bang rewrite, do small pieces step by step. Sounds like it's reducing risk, but actually, as we talked about, you have all this data synchronization happening, and you have different models. And what can happen is, if you migrate your write operations first, you might have some write operations going to the legacy and some write operations going to the new system for the same data. I can create an employee here, I can create an employee here. And we've had situations where in the new model, we decide we're going to have more strict validation. We're not going to let people use emojis in their emails, for example, because that was not valid and should never have been valid, that kind of stuff. You add some stricter validation, so your new system has fewer bugs. Then you get an event from the legacy system where there's an emoji in the email address, and you're like, well, I can't say no because they've already stored it and accepted it. So you have to deal with this in the short term when you have different rules and validations on each side. That can be very challenging too. Sorry, I covered two things in one slide there. So the bi-directional proposes this challenge where you have write operations on both sides. And then one of the pain points is that asymmetrical validation that I was talking about. So again, thinking about the building blocks, the patterns guide you, but it's all these lower level details that are really important to keep in mind. So I'll talk to you a bit now about Payfit, some real projects and some examples of how we're using this. How are we doing for time? Yeah, we're good. So Payfit is a French company focused on payroll primarily, and then HR after that. Payroll's kind of niche is smaller companies, like some companies with like 2 or 3 employees up to about 1,000 employees. So it's not like a big, huge HR system for like massive companies. It's actually very focused. What you can see here is kind of the main screen of the app. And there's a lot of intricacies in payroll. In France, for example, they have a lot of different rules in every industry. Like if you work in a certain industry and you have a certain level of seniority, there's a minimum salary that you can be paid, and there's a minimum amount of holidays you need to have. If you work in a different industry, the rules can be completely different. In the UK, we kind of have a very simple rule, like everyone has a certain minimum salary and a minimum number of holidays, and the rest is up to the company to decide for you to negotiate. In France, they have all these very specific rules around payroll. So there's a lot of complications around that. Yeah, what else? Like Payfit does a few other things around HR, so you can list all your employees, mes collaborateurs. That's like my collaborators, my employees. There's like holidays. What else is there? Yeah, basic HR stuff and payroll and things that support that, like holidays, expenses and things. That's kind of what the company does. And the company was, the company's about 10 years old. And what's the best way to explain this? Do I go forwards or backwards? Forwards or backwards, what do you prefer? Okay, so the company was formed like 10 years ago, and they got this system A, which is like the company monolith, right? A lot of companies start out this way. Startup starts up, you have one system, one monolith, everything goes in there. And what's interesting about Payfit is that monolith is a low-code platform. They built a low-code platform designed around the French law. and it grew into a platform for lots of other things. So there's some uniqueness about this story. I want you to keep in mind, whenever we talk about this system A, it's not real code, it's a different kind of low code, and it's not like a drag and drop UI, it's more like an Excel system. So the low code platform, system A, you define these variables and you define dependencies between your variables. So you can say, if I change someone's salary, that causes other things to be recomputed. You can imagine, right? If you say I got a mistake and this person left my company 2 months ago, you've got to recalculate a lot of different things based on that. So the domain I work in is more on the HR side, what we call employee management. And at the moment, and if we go back like 2 years, even more so, this domain about employee management was spread across 3 systems. They built system A, as I said, and they put a lot of stuff in there. And then in around 2020, it was starting to hit some challenges, right? It was difficult to add new features and scalability problems, and they said, we'll start to break out some of that functionality for managing our employees into system B. And then in 2023, 2024, they built another system that also handles employees. But the thing about system C is it was designed for a specific use case. It was designed for when a company first joins Payfit, when they first become a customer, there's this initial setup phase where you add all your employees. Normally, in a typical month, you might add 1 employee or 2 employees. System C was supposed to be this like separate piece for funneling companies at the start of the journey. But then a couple of years ago, it started to hit some pain points. It's like, well, we kind of have this employee stuff scattered across 3 systems. It's very painful and difficult to work with. In addition to that, system A was built 3 times, one for the UK, one for Spain, and one for France. So that's a lot of different ways to create an employee with a name and an address and all their contracts. And so what was agreed like 2023, 2024 was, we want to get to this architecture. All those bits of employee management logic spread across 3 systems, we want those in just one system. One code base, one database, none of that data synchronization madness that just causes lots of problems. And so that's the journey we're working on. But it's like, how do you get from that to that? What patterns do you choose? What are the principles that you might take on this journey? And I'll share some of the ones that we made. I think they were good decisions. It wasn't easy. I had a lot of doubt at various points in the journey because it was freaking hard. But at the start, we have these different priorities, right, pulling us in different directions. And we have a team with limited capacity. We don't have hundreds of people to do everything all at the same time. So we need to be smart, like, where do we start on this journey? Which pattern do we use first? So if I go back to this slide, company system A, there's a lot of teams in other domains like payroll and government declarations. They want to break out of the monolith and decouple themselves as well. But employee management is like the start of the process. You create your employees here and you create your contracts here, and then all these other domains like payroll, they need to know about that. So until we start publishing events here, they still have to go to the legacy. So one of their priorities is all these other domains that are saying, we want you to publish your events so that we can decouple from the legacy and do our own migration. We kind of got like 10 different migrations all happening or trying to happen at the same time. And then we've got stuff like the website where there's some product improvements we'd like to make to the company website around new abilities to search and filter in a more efficient way. So that's pulling us toward build these new APIs for the read model. And at the same time, the product team are saying, we want to do new stuff as well. We want to build some new features that require creating employees and contracts in different ways. So we were being pulled into all these different directions here, and we couldn't do everything at once. At the same time, I talked about before this domain model mapping. Payfit has been amazing for like DDD, I must tell you, like the model and concepts here have been fantastic, even if it's been painful to implement. So this is a great story. So when Payfit starts 10 years ago with that monolith I told you about, they have this concept called an employee. And an employee has different kinds of information. It has personal information, it has contract details and a contract type, stuff like your salary and things, and all those rules I told you about in France. As a company grows, they realize an employee can have multiple contracts, different kinds of employees. You might have employees that have short-term contracts, or you might have an employee that has multiple contracts at the same time. And they were like, it doesn't really make sense to have 5 employees who are all the same employee with a different contract. That's not really an employee, is it? So they renamed it to contracts. Just like, when I say rename, I mean, okay, that's the new word for it. We didn't replace it everywhere in the system. It's just like, that's the new name for it. So now, even all these years later, sometimes people say, have you got the employee ID for that record? I'm like, that's not an employee ID, that's a contract ID. Still today, this employee contract thing is very confusing because we also have employee IDs in the new system and they're UUIDs. But in the legacy system, they're Mongo IDs. So these IDs don't even look the same and people get them confused. What we're trying to achieve in the new model, the way that people think about the business, is that you have one collaborator, not an employee, because an employee is a specific kind of collaborator. You can also have interns and what they call mandates, mandataires, people that don't have a contract but work at your company. And we're also working towards like non-payroll employees like freelance. So we don't use employee anymore, we use collaborator. We don't put the personal information in the contracts. You put the personal information linked to the collaborator. So if I'm a collaborator with 5 contracts, my personal information is defined in one place and not 5. This was a decision I was part of myself. And we were like, does the contract need to include personal information? Do we have to really duplicate it in every place? So I went to the legal team and I said, legally, I went to 3 legal teams, UK, France, and Spain. And I said, does a contract legally need to contain personal information? And they said, no. So we're like, okay, we'll take it out. We'll keep this model. And then over time, the concept of a contract has also evolved. So now we have this concept of a working agreement. A contract is one kind of working agreement, but like I talked about, I've got a typo here that should say internship. You can have a mandate and an internship. These are different kinds of working agreements. So what I'm trying to say is, when we look at system A, it looks like this. When we look at system B and B, it looks a bit like this. When we look at system C, that's what we're trying to work towards. And so you can imagine, right, when you're trying to do a data integration, what happens if a modification to someone's personal address happens in system C and they have 5 contracts in system A? Do I update 5 contracts based on their new personal information here? And what if they update the personal information here in one contract? That will trigger an update here. Do I then go back and update the others as well? So this is what I talk about, the model mapping and the data synchronization. It combines in lots of very intricate ways. So talking about the choices we made, we kind of split this into 2 different tracks. The employee collaborator was one piece. That was more around the personal information. And then the contract and the working agreement was kind of a separate piece. So for the employee and collaborator, we took the right model first approach. And there were a couple of reasons for this. The first one was we wanted to implement a new use case where it could be created by a partner APIs. That didn't work before. So if we do the right model first, we can build these new features for partners. Payfit has a lot of partners, like, for example, Payfit does the payroll. Let's say you're a client, for example. You might use Payfit for payroll, but you might use another tool for your HR. So you want to be able to have your HR in one system synchronized across to the other for PayFit. So those were some kind of use cases that the business were asking for, like a big unlock for the business. If we can do these integrations, that will make life a lot easier. So we said, okay, we'll start with the right model first here. We started to build a new domain model with a bubble. It looks a bit like this. So System C is the one we're trying to keep and move everything into System C. So an integration will call this import employees. System C will publish an event, and then that event has to go to both System B and System A. And at the same time, you can create and you can modify this information in both of those systems. So a company could import some employees here, and they could also go into the UI and create them manually here or modify them here. And sometimes it happens, right? We have these problems sometimes called doublons. That means doubles or duplicates in French. Like, why do I have duplicate employees, customer support tickets? What went wrong here? And we're all thinking there's some crazy data synchronization somewhere, and it's like a race condition where the user did both things at the same time. Like this automatic import was happening, and another person at the company went into the UI and created the same employee. So that's what I'm talking about with these different systems, and the same for modifications. Sometimes someone might say, this employee's updated their address, but it's wrong. Okay, where is it wrong? Which page is it wrong on? Okay, that's a legacy system page. Some update here didn't get synchronized to cross over here because the record was updated here, but the user had deleted it here. And so this came after it was deleted, and they manually added it back afterwards. All these kind of different scenarios can happen around creation and modification and deletion. So it worked, but it was difficult to make this work. But I think, if we look at the different ways we could have done this, I think it probably was the right approach. Whatever approach you would have taken, there would have been some drawbacks. So happy with the approach, but yeah, just being honest about some of the challenges there. The data synchronization and the difference between the models made this very difficult. So if you're on a project, you're looking at the options and you're thinking, do we do a right model first migration? Those are some things to keep in mind, like what are all the different ways that the data that your new write operation is creating can be created in other ways or modified in other systems. So in reality, that's the simple view, but in reality, we have a lot of arrows going between all these three different systems. Like you can do almost anything anywhere. And we've got some like if statements in the code. Like if you get an event here and you think it was created here, you don't update your local database. But if you think it was created here for Spain, you do update the local database. A lot of this guesswork around how was this thing created, and a lot of issues where you can modify something here, an event goes across here, an event then goes down here, and it comes back here, and you think it's a new record. You don't realize this event coming back is because I just published one over here. So a lot of challenges there. So adding more write operations and more events to the system does make it more complex. I think it's really important to have good observability. And that's actually one place that we've used AI quite successfully, I would say, at PayFit in the last year or so. Having AI hooked up to our Datadog, having it hooked up to our event where we store all the events, it's able to identify where things went wrong. So that was the first one. Write model first was the right choice, I think. It was the right choice, but we added more write operations on the same data. We added more events, and it made things more complex, and it created a lot of work for us to do that and to maintain it. So the second choice was around the contract and the working agreement. So this is not the personal information, although it is the personal information in System A. So that, the different models here. And basically, we went for the events first here. I'll explain to you. Like I said before at PayFit, the employee management domain is kind of the start of this life cycle. You can't do anything until you create an employee and give them a contract. So we have all these domains like payroll and declarations and absences, and they're saying, we need these events from you so we can decouple from the legacy and start building our own, finishing our own modernization projects. But we're like, well, we're working on this crazy thing. We don't have time to build all these events for you. So there's a bit of a tension there. And so what we decided here was we can do the events first. So these other domains will publish some events from the legacy, and then they can consume those events. So the write operations are still happening in the legacy. We just publish these events so that other domains can be synchronized. Now, I said before not to use this pattern, and you shouldn't use this pattern. The thing about this pattern is your legacy system is going directly to all these other domains. That's your legacy model is going directly to all those domains. And so they are all now coupled to the legacy model. And they're going to have to do all this translation in their code bases between the legacy model and the new model. What I recommend in this situation is, I wouldn't say it's a hard and fast rule every time, but for us, what we said is, okay, employee management domain, we're busy on the right model for the employee entity, but we don't want all these domains. If all these domains are consuming these legacy events based on the legacy model, at some point, they're going to have to migrate to a new model when we've designed it properly. And that's going to be, we're creating even more mess here that has to be migrated later. So what we said is we found this halfway house that wasn't a huge amount of effort, but it also protected us. So what we said is we'll publish some events from a legacy, like a contract being registered, and we'll map it onto our new model here, and then all these other domains like payroll, they will get the new model. So we do the translation here for them. And that's kind of like a facade, right? In the future, we can migrate to the legacy to our new code. And all these domains here, they don't know about that. They just get these events and everything happens behind our interface, our events. So we have two different versions of the bubble here. In this version of the bubble, we migrate the events first, kind of like read side. And on the other side, in this version of the bubbles here, we have the new model on the write operations. So let's talk about this one. Let's talk about this pattern and why I absolutely hate it, even though it was the best choice available. The problem with this pattern is, again, the translation seems easy. I get this model from the legacy system, this event about a contract being registered in the old format, and I map it onto the new format for these other domains. But the problem is, like I said at PayFit, there are an incredible number of ways to create and modify an employee in a contract. Like every country, 3 countries with their own approaches. You then got like imports, UI creation, a lot of different ways, a lot of different use cases. And so this team payroll, for example, they would often come to us on Slack and say, we got an orphan contract. Someone's not getting paid this month because you didn't send us an event for that company. It's like, oh, okay, what happened here? And it's like, in the UK, they do something special with their integrations. And when normally you get an event from the legacy system and it has a status field on it. And the status field means something, and it's like status active. This is an active contract. But when the UK does these integrations, they put the contract into this active mode, but it's not really active. They're just abusing that field to make some other workaround work in their system. Not blaming anyone here, like everyone has to try and find ways to get the system to work. And at the start, if I go back here, these 3 system A's were designed to be independent, and now we're trying to make them work together. So all these local optimizations and workarounds that teams made, we're hitting every single one of them. And we get issues like the these events don't contain an end date. Like, why does the contract not have an end date? And it's like, oh yeah, in this one weird situation, the legacy system returns the value null as a string with the word null written inside it. So this pattern does work. It's just when you're building on a legacy system and it has all these workarounds and use cases in it, it's not like you get an event and you map it onto the new event. There's a lot of actual process and data and workarounds that you have to hit. And I would say, thinking about the amount of time it took, it looks very simple here. I must admit, it does look very simple here, but it's taken like 1.5 years to get to a point where these events are pretty solid in some cases. So the pattern is good. I do recommend the pattern. I do think we made the right choice. I think, if you compare these two approaches, with this approach, it's faster and it requires less effort. But with this approach, even though we hit a lot of problems, we were able to start building our own domain model here. And over time, we started to migrate write operations to this model. So even though we started publishing events, we were able to use that model and start migrating write operations to this and make that the source of truth. And I think at the end of the day, all these pain points we hit, they were going to get hit anyway. If we did this pattern, probably each of those teams are all going to be hitting the same problem 4 times and hitting the same issues. So I think we just had to be the ones that took the pain on that. It's crazy though, right? Like, I'll be honest with you, like sometimes I'm brushing my teeth at night, looking in the mirror, and I'm like, is there a possible edge case where this happens here and this goes across here? And it's like, oh my God, I need to go back to my computer, I can't sleep. It was quite scary. But when you get to the end and it's all working and people are using the events, it's also a very nice feeling. So like I was saying, the key thing here is with the employee, we chose to do the right model first for like one set of features. And with the contract and the working agreement, we chose to do the events first. But over time, we made lots of small decisions. We were gradually moving everything to these two systems. Sometimes you might migrate a write operation and sometimes a read operation. We didn't go all in on one particular pattern or approach. It's like, every month, we reflect on the plan and we look at what's changing. We have requirements from other teams, and it's like, actually, let's do that read operation later. Let's do this write operation now. So it's a very ongoing and dynamic thing. Okay, so let's talk about AI. Do I have time to talk about AI? I have 7 minutes. I went a bit slowly there, sorry. So it's related to the same project. Here's my colleague, Charles. The 2 examples I gave you before, they were mostly around the company monolith and the new system 2 that we were building. This system 1 in the middle that it was a bit pushed to the side. It wasn't causing a lot of pain or it wasn't the most problematic, but at some point we had to get rid of it. And so at the start of the year, we said, let's make an effort to try and see if we can use AI to clean up that piece. So the team's working on that bit over there. Me and Charles, we were like, let's see if we can get rid of system 1 quickly with AI. The company wanted some AI projects, and I said, this could be a good AI project. So the first thing we did is we created a project management tool using a Git repo. It was basically a folder structure with markdown files in it. And the reason we did this is, we want AI to be as helpful as possible on this project. If we just use a Git repo to store all the project information, then AI has access to the raw data. It doesn't have to go through Jira APIs and all that stuff. So that was what we did, and I think it was a very effective approach. Because what we could then do is we could build these commands like update plan. So we could just say to Claude or OpenCode, depending on which tool we were using at the time, we could say, we just had a meeting with the permissions and identity team, and here's what we learned. Using this update plan command, we just say that. We just had a meeting with the permissions team and we learned this. They don't want to own this API, or they do want to own this API. And this command knows all about our project. And so it knows, you have an open question. What you've just told me answers that open question. Or actually, that raises a new question. This plan you created, this information might invalidate one of these decisions you've made. So that was really cool, having someone who is able to take some new information and reflect on how does that affect what your plans, your patterns, all those choices. And that was very cool. And then what we also did is we built our own custom project management tool. In the old days, that would be a very stupid thing to do. But in this day and age, it was something that you can do in parallel. When you're working on one thing, you can be building this on the side, like, yeah, add this feature, add that feature. And so what this is, it's a Mercado graph. And what you can see down here is that the big blue block is the goal to finish the migration. And all these things are the things that we need to do and the dependencies between them. So this was built from our project management files I just told you about. And every time we wanted to do something or make the project easier to understand, we were able to add new features in here. Like, what am I supposed to do now? It's not clear to me. Okay, let's create a new tab in this UI that makes it clear. Here's what's in progress. And as I was talking about before, the context management was easy. On the second tab up there, it told me all the work in progress, kind of like a Jira board. So that was super cool. That helped us to plan things out, and it cost us almost nothing. And then you might be wondering, how do you go from Markdown files to this tool? Surely you're not generating that from Markdown files. That would be absolutely insane, right? So what we did is, in every Markdown file, we had front matter, YAML front matter in the file. So the Markdown file for like a piece of work has some front matter like, what's the status? Is this in progress? But then Claude likes to hallucinate. He likes to add Markdown fields that don't exist. So we added a schema, and then in the hooks, whenever AI makes a change, we have the schema that runs and says, you've just added a field into this Markdown file that doesn't exist. So now we kind of get this halfway house. And all of our commands are built around these schemas. I think, going even further, I can see how this could become even more powerful with a more advanced semantic layer. How long do I have left? I've got 3 minutes left, so I'll quickly go through this. Most important thing, Scott Hanselman talked about this, use deterministic tools wherever you can. Build deterministic tools for as much as possible. At Payfit, we use OpenAPI, so rather than asking AI, go find all the API endpoints in this code base, we just said, go read the OpenAPI spec. We use event catalog for events and NX for mono repos. I talked earlier a bit about touched on the idea of if you're asking AI to analyze code, how do you make that reliable? How do you know it doesn't hallucinate things? There's a few things we did. We had this discover inventory command, and we said, find all the API endpoints, and then for each API endpoint, use a fresh agent with a fresh context window. So use the context window as much as possible. And then one of the things I found, one of the principles I use a lot is when you're giving an AI instructions, you can say, here's the end state, go achieve this end state, but then you're letting the AI decide, what do I optimize for? It's going to try and be efficient. It will do something dumb and said, I did something dumb, but I wanted to save you some tokens. I'm like, I don't want you to save me tokens. I want you to do some proper job with quality. So in a lot of the commands we used, we actually gave the AI a very specific algorithm, telling it like, go through the files. We have these kind of files, the API route, the controller, the service, the data access, and then create a sequence diagram with line by line and reference the line numbers. And I found the results were very good with this. We forced it, we told it, you have to go into detail, you have to do these steps. And you can do that with a review as well. And when it comes to domain mapping, I found that AI can also be useful for that. I'll finish on this point. So I talked in the initial, we had like the domain mapping as one of the key challenges. In the commands, we taught AI how to do that. We gave it very specific instructions. So when you find an API in the current system, you have to decide, how do we migrate those consumers to the new system? Which API endpoint here is a good fit? And we gave it some characteristics around how to map models. And we told it specifically, like look at the domain language, for example. And it knew about our project language. And it was able to identify, yes, this one talks about an employee. This one talks about a collaborator. I know that these two are the same thing. but the IDs might not be the same thing, so the project context. And then what I told it also was the data alignment here. I told it, go through every single piece of data in this API endpoint and look in the target endpoint, does it support? And you have to write me a report in the table for every single piece of data if that data actually exists in the target API or not. So forcing it into those details and baking in around the mapping knowledge, that was quite useful. All right, I think I will stop there. Time quickly ran out, but I'll quickly say I did a talk about this AI project recently, and there's a separate slide deck about that. It's not on my website yet, but I'll put that on there today or tomorrow. All right, thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking to you today. Hope you enjoy the conference.